Thousands of people stepped into the streets of Miami. The sky had cleared. The wind was gone. For the first time in hours, everything felt quiet. People looked around and smiled. Some checked their homes. Others searched for neighbors. Many believed the hurricane was finally over. They were wrong. About 20 minutes later, some of those same people would be dead. The calm was not the end of the storm. It was the center of it. They were standing inside the eye of a massive hurricane, but almost no one in Miami understood what that meant. Most had never lived through a storm like this. They did not know the wind would come back. They did not know it would return from the opposite direction. And they had no idea the second half could be even more deadly than the first. So, they opened their doors. They walked away from shelter. They stepped into streets filled with broken glass, torn roofs, fallen trees, and rising water. Some went to help family. Some wanted to see the damage. Others simply wanted to feel safe again. Then the wind came back. Not slowly, not with a warning. It hit at full force. The people outside had nowhere to run. Buildings already weakened by the first half of the storm began to collapse. Water rushed back into the city. What looked like relief turned into a trap. And this raises a hard question. How could one of America's richest, fastest-growing cities fail to teach its people one basic fact that might have saved hundreds of lives? The history books say 372 people died in the Great Miami Hurricane of 1,926. But that number has never fully made sense. The real death toll may have been far higher. It's hard to believe now, but Miami was barely a city just 30 years before the disaster. Everything happened incredibly fast. Around 1,920, only about 30,000 people lived there. Just a few years later, that number had exploded past 100,000. By 1926, roughly 130,000 people called Miami home. But here's the part that really mattered. Most of those people weren't from Florida. 9 out of every 10 residents had moved in from places like Ohio, Illinois, New York, and other northern states. They came chasing warm weather, easy money, and the promise of a better life. What they didn't bring with them was experience. Most had never seen a major hurricane. They had never heard the sound of hurricane-force winds. They had never watched storm surge swallow streets. To them, hurricanes were stories in newspapers, not something that could wipe out an entire city overnight. At the same time, Miami was caught in one of the biggest real estate booms America had ever seen. Land along Biscayne Bay wasn't just getting more expensive. In some places, prices jumped 10 times, 20 times, even 50 times in just a few years. People weren't buying property because they wanted to live there. Many were buying contracts. They paid a small deposit, then sold that promise to someone else before they ever owned the land. People were making fortunes without building a single house. The whole city was running on excitement, easy credit, and the belief that prices would keep climbing forever. On the surface, Miami looked unstoppable. New neighborhoods, new hotels, new banks, new roads. Everything looked modern. But underneath all that growth was one thing money couldn't buy: experience. A city can build taller buildings. It can pave more roads. It can open more banks. But you can't build generations of hard-earned knowledge overnight. And when the hurricane finally arrived, that missing experience turned out to be the most expensive thing Miami didn't have. Long before weather satellites and live storm tracking, there was one man trying to protect Miami. His name was Richard W. Gray. He had been leading the Miami Weather Bureau since 1911. By the summer of 1926, he had spent 15 years watching the skies, studying storms, and learning how hurricanes behaved. But experience could only take him so far. The tools he had were incredibly basic by today's standards: a mercury barometer to measure air pressure, a wind gauge bolted to the roof, and a telegraph line that connected his office to Washington. That was it. No radar, no satellites, no aircraft flying into hurricanes, no computer models showing colorful forecast maps. To understand where the storm was going, Gray had to piece it together himself. Ships crossing the Caribbean sent radio reports about wind and air pressure. Every message was just one small piece of a much bigger picture. Gray spread those reports across paper maps and tried to imagine what the hurricane was doing beyond the horizon. Cuba actually had decades of experience tracking Atlantic storms. Their meteorologists often recognized dangerous hurricanes earlier than anyone else, but at the time, those Cuban forecasts were not fully built into the American warning system, so Gray worked with what he had. And honestly, he did an incredible job. Based on scattered reports from ships at sea, he calculated the hurricane's path and estimated when it would reach Miami. Later records showed he missed the actual arrival by less than 3 hours. For 1926, that was remarkably accurate. Around 11 p.m. on September 17, he officially issued a hurricane warning for the Miami area. The warning went out before the storm arrived. The science had done its job. But that leads to a question that's hard to ignore. What good is an accurate warning if the people receiving it don't understand what it's really trying to tell them? Sometimes the biggest problem isn't predicting the danger. It's making people believe it before it's too late. By late that night, the warning was already out. Hurricane flags were raised at government cut. The Miami Herald printed a small notice in its late edition. Anyone paying close attention could have seen the signs, but most people didn't. The city went to bed like any other night. The problem wasn't that there was no warning. The problem was that almost nobody understood what the warning actually meant. If you've lived through a hurricane before, the word carries weight. You remember the sound of the wind shaking the walls. You remember water forcing its way through doors. You remember how quickly everything can fall apart. But for most people in Miami, hurricane was just another word in the newspaper. It wasn't a memory. It wasn't something they had ever felt. Around 2 that morning, the storm began to prove just how serious it was. Winds pushed past 100 miles per hour. Richard Gray kept watching from the Weather Bureau, knowing the storm was getting stronger by the minute. The wind gauge on the roof had one job. It could measure winds up to 120 miles per hour. Then, sometime between 3 and 4 a.m., it was ripped completely off the building. Just like that. The only instrument that could record the strongest winds was gone. No one would ever know exactly how powerful the hurricane became that night. Inside the building, Gray still had one instrument left, his mercury barometer. He watched the pressure keep falling, below 29 inches, then below 28, then below 27.8, then lower still, around 27.7 inches. He had spent 15 years studying weather along the Atlantic coast. He had never seen the pressure drop that far. At that moment, he realized something no forecast could fully prepare him for. This wasn't just another hurricane. It was becoming something far beyond anything he had ever experienced. Then something happened that almost no one in Miami had ever seen before. At around 6:15 that morning, the wind stopped. Not little by little. It stopped almost instantly. 1 second, there was a deafening roar. The next, there was silence. The sky began to clear. A few people even said they could see patches of blue above them. The air turned warm and heavy, almost peaceful. After hours of fear, it felt like the nightmare was finally over. So people started coming outside. They stepped out of hotels that had survived the first wave. Families left their shelters. Neighbors called out to each other. Some wanted to check on loved ones. Others walked toward the bridges or the harbor to see how much damage had been done. For the first time that morning, people felt hopeful, but they were making a terrible mistake. No one had explained what the eye of a hurricane really was. Back then, most Americans had never even heard the term. There were no public safety campaigns, no TV weather reports, no emergency alerts telling people to stay inside if the wind suddenly stopped. So, they trusted what they could see. The sky looked better. The wind was gone. The danger had to be over. For about 35 minutes, thousands of people walked through streets covered with broken glass, fallen trees, and shattered buildings, believing they had survived the worst. They had no idea they were standing in the exact center of the storm. Then everything changed again. Without warning, the backside of the hurricane slammed into Miami. The wind didn't slowly build back up. It exploded across the city at full force, from the opposite direction. People who had stepped outside had nowhere to hide. Buildings already weakened by the first half of the storm couldn't take another hit. Doors, walls, and roofs gave way. The storm surge returned, stronger than many expected. What felt like the safest moment of the entire hurricane became the deadliest. Sometimes the most dangerous part of a disaster isn't when everything is loud, it's when everything suddenly goes quiet. The people who survived the first half of the hurricane all had one thing in common. They stayed inside. Their homes, hotels, and shelters took the first hit for them. Windows shattered, roofs shook, walls cracked. But those buildings still gave them a chance to survive. Then the wind stopped. People thought it was over, so they walked outside. That single decision changed everything. When the backside of the hurricane reached Miami, it came from the north-northwest with incredible force. There was no slow warning, no gentle build-up. One moment, the city was quiet. The next, it was roaring again. The ocean came back too. The storm surge that had pulled away during the calm rushed inland for a second time, pushing water deeper into neighborhoods that people had just stepped back into. Inside the Weather Bureau, Richard Gray watched the barometer reach its lowest point of the night. It dropped to 27.61 inches of mercury, or about 935 millibars. At the time, that was one of the lowest air pressure readings ever recorded at a Weather Bureau station anywhere in the United States. Outside, the damage became even worse. Many buildings had already been weakened by the first wave of wind. Their frames were cracked. Their supports were strained. They were barely standing. Then the wind hit from the opposite direction. Structures that had survived the first assault suddenly gave way. Walls collapsed. Roofs tore off. Entire sections of buildings failed almost at once. Some of the newest hotels on Miami Beach didn't fall during the first half of the hurricane. They collapsed during the second. That's what makes this storm so unforgettable. It wasn't just the strength of the wind. It was the false sense of safety that came right before it. Sometimes the loudest part of a disaster isn't what takes the most lives. Sometimes it's the silence in the middle that convinces people the danger has already passed. By late morning, the worst of the storm had finally passed. The wind had weakened enough for Richard Gray to step outside the Weather Bureau and see what was left of Miami. He walked slowly through water that reached from his ankles to nearly his shins. Everywhere he looked, something was gone. Palm trees had been ripped out and thrown across the streetcar tracks. The striped canvas awnings that once covered storefronts downtown had completely disappeared. Not torn, not hanging loose, just gone. Then he stopped in front of one of the city's tallest hotels. It stood 6 stories high, but a huge section of its outer wall had been ripped away. The rooms inside were completely exposed. It looked like someone had sliced open a dollhouse. Beds were still sitting where people had slept only hours before. Closets were still standing. Furniture hadn't moved much. The only thing missing was the wall that had protected everything inside. Water flowed through the lobby like a slow-moving river. Standing there, Gray wasn't just looking at storm damage. He was looking at the collapse of an idea. Miami believed that newer automatically meant stronger. New hotels, new neighborhoods, new engineering, new money. People assumed all of it could handle whatever nature threw at it. That night proved otherwise. Most of the buildings that failed weren't centuries old. They were some of the newest buildings in the city. Miami had been built at incredible speed. Land changed hands almost overnight. Neighborhoods appeared almost as fast as people could invest in them. The city grew as quickly as real estate deals could close. But the hurricane moved even faster. In a matter of hours, years of construction, millions of dollars in investment, and countless dreams were ripped apart by Category 4 winds. Nature didn't care how new the buildings were. It only cared whether they were truly strong enough. And that may have been the hardest lesson Miami learned. New doesn't always mean better. Sometimes it just means it hasn't been tested yet. There's one part of this story that almost nobody talks about. Months before the hurricane hit, Miami had already received a warning. It just didn't come from the weather. In January 1926, a Danish steel ship called Prince Valdemar capsized at the entrance to Miami Harbor. It stayed there. For the next 8 months, the wreck blocked the city's main shipping channel. Large cargo ships couldn't get in. They couldn't get out. That may not sound like a big deal at first, but for a city growing as fast as Miami, it changed everything. Building materials like lumber, cement, and structural steel had to be unloaded somewhere else and hauled into the city by truck. Construction slowed down. Costs went up. Projects took longer to finish. The boom that had made Miami famous was already starting to lose momentum. By the time the hurricane arrived, the city's economy wasn't as strong as people believed. The warning signs had been there for months. Bank activity had actually peaked back in October of 1925. After that, it kept falling month after month. Money was getting tighter. Confidence was fading. The real estate market was already beginning to crack. Then, the hurricane showed up. It didn't create Miami's crisis from nothing. It simply finished, in one terrible night, what had already been falling apart for months. And that's the part that really sticks with me. Prince Valdemar wasn't just a shipwreck sitting in the harbor. It became a giant steel reminder that something in Miami had stopped moving forward. Every person in the city could see it. Every ship had to deal with it. Yet almost nobody treated it like the warning it really was. Sometimes disasters don't begin with the moment everything falls apart. Sometimes they begin quietly, long before anyone is willing to admit there's a problem. By the time everyone finally sees the truth, the collapse is already underway. There's another part of this story that's easy to overlook. The problem wasn't just the hurricane. It was also the ground the city was standing on. Before around 1913, much of what we now call Miami Beach wasn't really solid land. It was mostly mangrove swamps and long stretches of sandbars. Developers wanted to turn it into the next great resort city. So they changed the landscape. Huge dredging machines pumped sand up from the bottom of Biscayne Bay and spread it across the area. In total, about 8 million cubic yards of sand were moved to create new land. Then the construction began. Hotels went up, roads were paved, homes were built. Everything looked permanent. But underneath, that ground was still man-made. When the hurricane hit, nature reminded everyone of that. The wind wasn't the only thing moving. The sand started moving too. In some places, it washed back across the roads. Entire sections were buried. The ground itself became unstable as water and sand shifted together beneath the weight of buildings. Years later, engineers would describe this kind of behavior as soil liquefaction. Back in 1926, people didn't have that term. They only knew the land they trusted wasn't acting like land anymore. Looking back, it's clear that Miami wasn't just growing too fast. It was expanding onto ground that was far more vulnerable than most people realized. And that's a lesson that still matters today. A building can look brand new. It can be tall, expensive, and built with the latest technology. But you can't judge how safe it is just by looking at what's above the ground. Sometimes the most important part of any structure is the part you never see. When the storm was over, people wanted one answer. How many lives had been lost? In December 1926, the Red Cross released its official report. It listed 372 people dead and about 1,700 injured. Those numbers have appeared in history books ever since. But the more I looked into this story, the more one thing became clear. That number tells only part of what happened. The Red Cross counted the people it could identify. Residents of Miami, Miami Beach, Coral Gables, and other incorporated cities. People whose deaths were reported by hospitals, funeral homes, or local officials. People with names. People whose families could be contacted. But not everyone fit into those records. Thousands of construction workers had come to Miami during the building boom. Many were black laborers or recent arrivals from the Bahamas, Georgia, and Alabama. They lived in temporary camps outside the city limits, in simple shelters made from tar paper and scrap wood. Those camps were built on some of the lowest ground around. When the hurricane came through, many of them were simply wiped away. One Red Cross photograph from the days after the storm shows one of those camps completely gone. The caption doesn't list the number of people who died. It simply says, "Extent of loss, unknown." That single sentence says more than most statistics ever could. The truth is, many of those workers were never fully counted because the system wasn't built to count people living outside its official records. Their names weren't documented. Their addresses weren't registered. And when they disappeared, many disappeared from history as well. So I don't think the number 372 was a lie. It was an honest count of the people the system was able to see. The real tragedy is that the system couldn't see everyone. That's why many historians today believe the true death toll was much higher. Not because someone tried to hide the truth, but because some lives were never included in the records to begin with. Sometimes history doesn't erase people on purpose. Sometimes they're simply left outside the categories that history chooses to count. The storm didn't just destroy homes. It changed the future of Florida. Over the years, historians have gone back through cemetery records, insurance claims, and census data. Many now believe the real number of people who died was somewhere between 800 and more than 1,000. We'll probably never know the exact number, not because the evidence was destroyed, because, in many cases, the records were never created in the first place. But the damage didn't stop with the loss of life. Just 1 month after the hurricane, Florida's real estate market collapsed. The boom that had made Miami famous came to an abrupt end. Bank activity dropped sharply. Money dried up. Confidence disappeared. By 1928, more than 100 banks across Florida had failed. Property values in Miami-Dade had fallen by about 80% from their peak in 1925. In many ways, Florida was already living through an economic depression nearly 3 years before the stock market crashed on Wall Street in 1929. That's what makes this story so important. The hurricane and the financial collapse weren't two separate events. They were connected. The market was already slowing down, but the storm turned a weakening economy into a full-scale collapse almost overnight. Sometimes, a disaster doesn't create a crisis. It simply pushes one that's already unfolding past the point where it can no longer be ignored. You'd think a tragedy like Miami in 1926 would never happen the same way again. But history tells a different story. Just 2 years later, in 1928, another deadly hurricane struck Florida. Once again, many migrant workers living outside official city boundaries were left out of the first death counts. The lesson hadn't fully been learned, and the storms didn't stop. Over the decades, Florida was hit again and again. Then came Hurricane Andrew in 1992, crossing the coast not far from where the 1,926 hurricane had made landfall. After every disaster, the same pattern repeated itself. Building codes got stronger, insurance rules changed, the city was rebuilt, and somehow it always came back even bigger than before. Then, a new generation moved in, people who had never lived through the last major storm. Studies have shown that personal memories of a major hurricane start to fade after about 7 to 10 years. In places where new residents keep arriving, that shared memory often doesn't last much longer than 15 years. Today's warning systems are far better than they were in 1926. We have satellites, radar, smartphones, and emergency alerts. But one thing hasn't changed very much: human nature. When the wind suddenly stops, when the sky clears, when everything feels calm, people still want to believe the danger is over. And that's why this story still matters. The man who stepped outside during the eye of the hurricane in 1926 never really disappeared. Today, he lives in a taller building. He drives a newer car. He has better technology. But when the wind goes quiet, he still faces the same choice. And sometimes, that choice is what decides who makes it home.